Hi and welcome to another Ask GMBN Tech. This is the Q&A session. You ask the questions, we give you the answers. Get your questions in the comments underneath. Please use the hashtag Ask GMBN Tech so we can tell which ones are comments and which ones are questions. Right, first up this week then, what have we got? We've got loads of questions. The first one is from James Proudfoot. Hi Dolly, I recently overpressurized my tyre when trying to do a tubeless conversion and exploded it. My hearing went funny for a while. I shouldn't laugh at that, but it's kind of funny. The tyre is now out of shape and the sidewall hangs over more on one side than the other. You can especially tell by how buckled the wheel looks when span on the frame. Is this something I can resolve and will running it with a tube be okay? It sounds like you stretched the sidewall of the tyre a bit here. So some people call this delamination. Now, I have spoken to tyre designers about this in the past, and they've all universally pretty much said that you can't really delaminate a mountain bike tyre with the way that the tyre is actually melted together as such when it's cured. But if it stretches, you can actually tear parts of that tyre. So it does sound like it's stretched a little bit, which is a bit of a problem. Now, I have done this before with various brand tyres over the years, this exact thing. Some of them from hitting turns where you sort of feel like you rip the tyre off the rim and it can actually sort of buckle the tyre slightly. Now, yes, you could run it with a tube in there, that'll be fine. If it will seal, you could still run it with your tubeless setup, but it will never be quite the same. So unfortunately, it does sound like you're out of luck on this one. It does happen, unfortunately, from time to time, although I haven't heard of one for a while, actually. Certainly not from anyone I know locally, but unlucky on that front. Just check that it's not so warped that it affects the ride in corners or if it rubs the frame. That's the main thing you need to look out for on that. Next up is from Box Chief. Dolly, can you use suspension grease like SRAM butter instead of a general grease in areas like headset? I also believe you can't use general grease in your suspension. Is this correct? Yes, okay, so generic grease, there's various different types, okay? So some greases are not safe for use on rubbers and things like that. So you think of some of the elements of suspension forks, you have rubber seals and things like that. So the grease can actually be harmful to it, but also generic grease is very thick, very it's heavy duty stuff, very water resistant. And the thick nature of it that makes it so good for use on bearings and other things is the exact opposite for suspension, where you've got sliding elements. It needs to be a very thin, runny grease there. So the suspension element, you're not trying to keep water out of that thing by using the grease. You're trying to make it operate better. There's a difference between the two in the way you use them. So really my long way round answer is for suspension products, only use a suspension safe grease. Something that's designed for the job, something that's very thin and runny. Of course, it will wear in time and you'll need to put fresh grease in there. Now, I wouldn't bother putting that stuff in headsets or anything else because the fact it's so very thin, and also with the sheer amount of water and stuff that can get into areas like that, it'll just get rid of the stuff. So stick to a regular grease for general use on the bike and a suspension grease for the suspension stuff. Although you can buy some regular greases that are suspension safe, but to be honest, I think you're still better off going for a specialist suspension grease because of the fact it is designed for the job. Keep them apart and they'll last longer. I've got some SRAM, in fact I've got two on the go, I've got one over here and I've got one at home. SRAM butter, you don't use that much of that stuff, so it's fine, whereas I like the workshop tubs of generic grease rather than tubes if I can help it, because you get really good amount for the money and it lasts a long time as well. Next up from M2 Graphics. Could you do a segment about general dropper post usage on trail and general maintenance? I've been riding for 25 plus years and have only just got a bike with a dropper post last season. I still don't feel like I can use it everywhere I should, or really have a good technique for getting the post down whilst moving. Perhaps there's a video I can sort of do a collab with like Neil or Rich or someone over on GMBN for this. Because yeah, actually when you first use a dropper post, I think most people are guilty of just slam it down for the descents and all the way up for the climbs. But actually the real strength in using a dropper post is just dropping it like an inch or so, maybe an inch and a half, on undulating rough terrain, the sort of terrain where you get kicked by the saddle but you still want to keep the power down. That is like one of the best areas to use a dropper post. And yeah, you can actually maximize the way you use the thing. So I can probably do something on setup and the maintenance side of things and combine the video with something on GMBN on how you use them out on the trail. Yeah, I think we can do that. So something just in the meantime to think about, two things are your setup and basic maintenance tips. So for setup, you want to make sure your lever, whatever brand it is in the most usable place for you. Now, if you've got a if you've got a gear lever on your left-hand side of your handlebars, you're going to need to run it on the top, which isn't the best place. If you've got a one-by system, this is where running the dropper post lever on the left side is best, because you can put it in place of that shifter, so it's in a really intuitive place to use. If not, you're going to have to fiddle around a little bit to do that. For example, on my Canyon Lux, my cross-country bike, I've got my dropper post lever there, but it's also got a lockout lever for the rear shock and the front fork. I've moved the lockout lever in because I don't use it that much, and I've got the dropper post lever in place of it, so I can use that whenever I need to. Now I can still reach the lockout lever without too much problem, but I've decided to keep it all on the underneath of the bars just to keep everything looking that bit neater, because it can get a bit like a snake's wedding going on up the front there. And get into the habit of using it. It's there to be used. Drop it a little bit. You know, you'll find just dropping it an inch, actually a lot of the time that's more than enough. You know, and then you save it at the real big times for all the way down, get it out of the way, get your centre of gravity nice and low, and enjoy it. Now, treat your dropper post like you would a suspension fork. So keep it as clean as possible around the seal. If your post isn't a hydraulic offering like the RockShox Reverb, for example, then chances are you can undo the main seal head on there, and you can clean it under there, and you can put some suspension grease or suspension oil under there just to keep it running nice and smoothly from time to time. But the key with it, really keep it nice and clean. I did do a video on trying to speed up cable operated posts with a cartridge design. There's going to be a link to that in the description underneath. That gives you a bit of an idea of how dropper posts work. I obviously use the Crank Brothers one in there, but I think I referred to some other brands as well. But it'll give you an idea of how you might be able to sort of maintain it and get the most out of it. But I like your idea for the video. I'll see what we can do with that one. Next up's from Phoenix MTB. Hi guys. Hey Doddy, do you think in the future that the MTB lineup will be dominated by high pivot bikes? Interesting. I certainly hope not. So high pivots, unquestionably, for certain types of riding, are going to offer an amazing suspension action, but they're not everything. So as we know, with all suspension designs on mountain bikes, there's a compromise, and the compromise is the fact you've got to pedal the thing. So in cross country, for example, you're never really going to see a high pivot because you just want the bike to be as fast and efficient as possible, and having some suspension is good for grip and traction and things, but it's not the overriding factor. It's a combination of having some suspension but allowing the bike to be as light as possible. Hence why Santa Cruz have gone away from the VPP design, which was their ultimate way of controlling the bike's suspension, and they've moved to a far more simplified system purely for the cross-country approach. So you won't see it there for sure. Now in the trail market, well, there's a couple of brands that are going to launch bikes very soon, in fact, after watching this video. And they've got almost trail bikes with high pivots, and undeniably they work really, really well. The rear suspension tracks the ground amazingly. Is there any more friction in the system? I feel like there is, but I haven't done a test to actually see that. But you're running more chain, you're running it around another wheel, so arguably there's something else to maintain. There's other things in the system. However, the type of bike that they're for, pedaling is just one part of the picture. Yeah, so if you're happy to pedal something, you know, winch your bike up a big long fire road or whatever it is to get to the top of something incredible to ride down, then sometimes the high pivot thing, the way the bikes are going to ride is actually going to overrule the pedaling side of things. So I think you'll definitely see more in the enduro category and creeping into the trail market, but they're not going to take over. Downhill, I don't see why more people wouldn't use them. In fact, the only reason why I can see brands not choosing to use a high pivot design is trying to maintain dynamic geometry on the bike. So there is one downfall with extreme high pivot bikes that people don't talk about, and that's the fact your chainstay grows quite a lot. So arguably, bottoming out at high speed on a rough section, the bike can get more stable because the back end's going to grow slightly. That's brilliant. That's a good thing. However, there are situations, and this won't suit all riders and the way that you ride a bike, not necessarily courses and places. There are situations where that's not going to be a desirable thing. For example, if you're to push out of a turn and you want to get the bike up on the back wheel and that, at that point when you're going through the travel, you know, your chainstays at the longest, the front end is going to be the heaviest and the hardest to pick up. So it's not going to respond well to that agile style of riding that some riders like to have. Whereas if you want all out speed and the bike is going to be planted through rough stuff and the fast stuff, then arguably a high pivot could be the best. I'm still 50-50. Like, I think they're amazing, but I'm not convinced I would only have them. I'd certainly have a cross-country bike and maybe a high pivot as a trail bike, but interesting topic, I think. Let us know what you think in the comments underneath, what you actually think about high pivots. Anyone that's ridden one, chip in, please do. Let us know what you think. Mr. MVDL next. Great stuff from GMBN as usual, keep it up. Thank you very much, by the way. Due to current supply issues of new bikes, do you think it's worth spending my money on my 15-year plus rusty bike just to keep it running long enough till I can get my hands on a new bike? My old bike needs a new drivetrain, brakes, tyres and a shock service to perform at an acceptable level. What's your expectation with regards to when new bikes can be available again? Manufacturers and shops keep postponing delivery dates. Thanks and greetings from your North Sea neighbour. Okay, well, for starters, I'm especially an advocate here on GMBN Tech of keeping your bike going. Unless it's so insanely old that it's just going to cost you more effort than it's worth, I'm all for fixing bikes. Keep your bike going. It'll save you money because you're not spending money on something that's much more expensive. But more to the point, as you're saying at the moment, there's huge lead times. Now, this is going to vary wildly depending on brands and the situations. Now, I've spoken to some industry insider friends, and one of them working for a fairly small manufacturer tells me there's nearly 600 days that they're waiting for suspension units from a certain brand. 600 days that they're waiting. So you think what that's going to do to their lead times to be able to get the bikes out to people buying them? That's really, really unlucky for the smaller brands like that are suffering, especially when you consider some of like the giant brands out there will just be hoovering up all of those parts to get their bikes out as fast as possible. Now, we said, been saying it probably for 6 months, maybe longer now, we're locked down to lose track, but if you see a bike that you're into, buy it. If you're in the market for it, get on with it, because you can't just keep waiting for stuff. The market, you know, needs stuff to be sold anyway, and we'll be waiting forever. But no, I'd keep your bike going, to be honest. Yeah, just because your bike needs a new drivetrain, it doesn't mean you need to like put expensive stuff on it. You can put budget stuff on it to keep it trickling over. And let's face it, even if you were to order a new bike and you're waiting for it, it would still be worth fixing up your old bike. Because if nothing else, you've got a run around bike, you've got a rat bike, you've got a bike that you could sell. It's worth it. Get involved, get your bike fixed up, definitely, I think. Yeah, so you say shock service, that's not a problem. Like, getting a shock service is a good thing anyway to make sure it works as it should do. Drivetrain, you can do budget drivetrain, no problem at all. The only thing you're gonna have with a budget drivetrain is it can be heavier, really. Is that really an issue? Not for many people. Brakes, obviously, bleeding brakes, that can be nearly free. Yeah, you need some fluid and a bleed kit, but that kit you're going to be able to use on other brakes in future, so that's worth doing. Brake pads, of course, that's a consumable, you always have to replace those. Tyres, that's a consumable, you always got to replace those as well, so yeah, get on with it, I'd say, and good luck, and thanks for watching. Next one's from Elvin Fengler. Oh, that's a cool name. Where are you from, Elvin? That's a wicked name. I've got a question about bedding in brake pads. I know everyone does it slightly differently, but the essence of this process is to get brake pad stuff on the rotor. Why do people put water on the brake pad rotor? Is it to aid cooling? Do wet pads bed in better than dry? I never put water on the brakes when bedding in and never had issues. Okay, so there's different schools of thought on this. So yes, arguably water could create a bit more friction. Of course, you don't have to do that. I've done dry bedding in, I've done wet bedding in, not through getting the wet, just because it's wet where we live, occasions like that. But there's also some other cool tricks. So I did this in a video, and actually I got this from Jason Marsh, the mechanic. Now, what he likes to do is put a bit of moisture between the brake pads and rub the actual pads together. So the top surface of the pads is already starting to sort of come off, which means they're going to mate better with the disc rotors when you put them on. In fact, I put that in I think I bedded in some pads on some SRAM brakes. The link to that video is going to be underneath, and I actually tried that out and it did work extremely fast to get them bed in. But is it the right way? I don't know. I'm not sure there is a right way because of the fact we're all riding different conditions with different pads. I think whatever works for you, but ultimately getting a good amount of material from the pads onto the rotor in an even manner, that is what you need to be doing. So do it by the way that works best for you. And the last question this week is from D. Allen. Simple question, Loctite or threadlock on spoke nipples? I have one individual spoke that always comes loose, like almost all of the thread. No, categorically don't do this because of the fact that you need to be adjusting your spoke nipples from time to time to get eggs and get bends and stuff and buckles out of the rim. So actually a lot of wheel builders will use, well, some will use grease, I'm sure, but many of them use a small amount of oil on the threads to enable them to tighten the spokes correctly, but without binding the actual spoke. So when you're actually truing a wheel or even building a wheel, something you have to do is relieve the pressure on those spokes or relieve the tension on them, because as you tighten the actual spoke nipple, sometimes the spoke can twist slightly. And in doing so, when you ride, that twisting has got to undo itself at some point, and it quite often undoes that spoke nipple. So I would suggest using a bit of oil on them, if anything, and check your actual spoke nipple and the spoke. Maybe the threads are gone in it. It's quite common if it's just got like a brass nipple or an alloy nipple on there, and replace the actual nipple. That should hopefully be the end of your problem. If it's not, let us know in the comments and hopefully we can help figure out what it is. Well, there we go. That's the end of this week's Ask. If you've got any more questions, let us know and we'll see you next time. See you later.